Welcome to our Center for Geopolitics panel on the Taiwan elections that have just recently taken place on Saturday. And so I'm really, really happy to be joined today by Jonathan Sullivan, who is Associate Professor of Politics at the University of Nottingham, as well as Chun-Yi Li, who's also Associate Professor of Politics at University of Nottingham, and Hans Chong, who is Professor of Politics at National Taiwan University. Now, Professor Tong seems to be having a bit of trouble joining our meeting. Oh, there he is. Fabulous. Welcome, and thank you for staying up and tuning in with us. So I wanted to turn first, if I could, to Jonathan Sullivan, just for a very brief overview of sort of what was going on, at least on the presidential side, and if he wants to talk a little bit on the legislative side as well. So go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Hi, everybody. So we are looking at the 8th presidential election, I think now that's been directly elected. The first thing that I really want to emphasize is that this was a perfectly normal election. I know that there was a lot of hype around this election, a lot of hype from within Taiwan about whether this was an election for war or peace or democracy versus authoritarianism, that this was going to be a pivotal election, a watershed election. I don't think it was anything of the sort. I think this is a perfectly normal election. The turnout was normal. The information environment was normal, for better and worse. The campaign was normal. It was a slow-burning campaign. Right up until November, it was dominated by this question of whether the opposition candidates were going to align, were going to cooperate. A lot of the issues were subsumed in this soap opera, and anybody who's saying that this is a definitive or unequivocal outcome, I think is misguided in that. I think the strength of the inferences that we can make on the basis of the results are very limited at the moment. We need to see what the post-election survey data tells us about why people voted in the way that they did. I think, some of the definitive statements I've read in the press over the last 2 days about, this is an unequivocal rejection of this or that, or an unequivocal, endorsement of Taiwan's route or whatever. I think we need to take those with a pinch of salt. I think the main message from my side is that pretty much everybody who won also has some things to be concerned about, and pretty much everybody who lost also can take solace in some things. This is an election with really mixed results, and that's going to be the basis of the talk that I do in a minute.
Great, thank you so much. Now I'd like to turn briefly to Hans Tong, just to ask, first off, what's the mood like in Taiwan during the election and just in the aftermath? And then also, if you could speak a little bit about kind of how different voting constituencies may have broken in different ways, particularly, who voted for Ko Wen-je, and what can we surmise about the character of the race as a three-way race, as opposed to if it had been a two-way race between Lai and Ho? And also, what do we make of the results on the legislative side?
Okay, so yeah, thanks for having me. And I think general people's mood are happy in the sense that they're just having another great election, and then it's pretty competitive and fair. And also, I think there's also a sense of great uncertainty among people. And first of all, as you just asked, of course, I mean, people were puzzled about the voters who voted for Ko Wen-je, because this is a new party, and not the used two-party system where we have DPP and KMT. So I just saw analysis recently about this, just actually 2 nights around the election, that basically the voters for Ko Wen-je, they are younger, or they're mostly below 40 years old, and then they are richer. So, and also they are more well educated. So, in other words, I think what kind of surprises me after the election is that, so first of all, DPP used to be very good at attracting young voters to vote for them. So that's the first surprise. And second, I think KMT was a little bit, the candidate of KMT was a little bit weaker than we expected. And third, this new constituency that Ko-Wen-je was able to garner was really surprising, given this party only is about like 4 years old. So that kind of gives you a general sense that the breakdown of voters who voted for Ko-Wen-je. And of course, that also says a lot about who voted for KMT and DPP. And I think for KMT, of course, they have old, those are older people and those who are more pro kind of unification and also deep blue kind of people. And also for DPP, I think they also are able to consolidate their base. But the problem is, I think compared to Lai Ching-te's predecessor, Tsai Ing-wen, who was able to actually get a lot of support from younger generation, obviously Lai Ching-te kind of failed to do that this time around. So I think that also adds to the uncertainty, as you just mentioned, that especially the legislative end. So now KMT has about like 42 seats in this new Congress, and then TPP enjoys 51. And then TPP, Taiwanese People's Party, has about 8 seats in the Congress, and therefore none of them enjoys the stable majority in the Congress, and therefore I think that as to the second point, people also have a great sense of uncertainty because we never had this kind of situation, or at least not until we have to go back to 2000 to have that situation where none of the parties enjoy the majority. And especially now Lai Ching-te is a minority president. He only has like 40% of the vote among the constituency, and therefore there you could have, because you have the three-way race and also 3 parties in Congress now. So I think there are lots of different coalitions that could be formed among them, and therefore people, I think until now the jury is still out in terms of what kind of coalition they're going to form. And I guess what I can of course elaborate on in a bit is that this also adds to more complexity in the cross relationship. And for example, I think as we have seen from Beijing's initial response from that very conciliatory and soft statement where they just emphasize DPP has lost the majority, and also they will continue to work with people, political forces in Taiwan, other political forces in Taiwan that are willing to promote unification. And therefore, it seems that it seems to give Beijing a way out, right? So instead of like having to respond forcefully under a tighter time pressure, given this Lai's win, they can actually, couch their argument in this very mixed electoral results. But that also means that it's hard to assess what kind of responses Beijing might actually going to give. For now, it's pretty muted and pretty soft, but we don't know what's going to come.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'd be curious to pick up afterwards on several of those strands, or once we're through this preliminary round. But next, let's turn to Chun-Yi Li to ask about sort of what this means in terms of Taiwan's global status or broader status in sovereignty terms, in cross-straits terms, and also other aspects of foreign policy and international relations. Right? Does this move the needle one way or the other, or is this really just a continuation of the status quo that we've had for the last 8 years or so?
Thank you, Bill, and it's a pleasure to be with our watcher to care about the immediate reaction or results after the presidential and legislative election over the weekend in Taiwan. Well, in terms of the cross-strait relations, which Heinz just mentioned about the Beijing's reaction, that is true that Beijing they have no way else, they can say, but also we can see just within 48 hours, one of Taiwan's diplomatic ally, Nauru, has been swift to Beijing, and Taiwan now is only left for 12 formal diplomatic allies now. I would say that is an immediate reaction from Beijing to intimidate Taiwanese voters, saying that you did wrong thing. We don't want you to elect a more pro-independence party, the DPP, as the president. And this is the result you will have. And also Beijing prior election mentioned that, well, the ECFA, which is a semi-free trade agreement between Beijing and Taiwan, if the DPP candidate won, now it's letting the president-elect enter the presidential office, they would consider to suspend the ECFA as a whole, which would definitely also impact on Taiwan's economy. Nevertheless, so that is what we see. Taiwanese voters knew Beijing's intimidation, both economic coercion and also military intimidations. Fighter jets cross the straits rather frequent since 2028 August, and all the intimidation of blockades the Taiwan Straits, not necessarily military invasion, but blockade Taiwan Strait, which would endanger Taiwanese energy and also the resources that Taiwan need to import it from the Taiwan Straits. Taiwanese people knew of that and yet still vote for a party which is more trying to be away from the Beijing's orbit. So from my perspective, I see this is, as I echo to the first speaker, Jonathan Sullivan's good comments, this is the victory of democracy in a sense, that a people of Taiwan understood the threat of Beijing and yet still vote more. You could argue that not much more, but 40% compared to KMT's 33%. It is more that DPP received the votes. Still vote more for the DPP and stand firm on the sovereignty issue that Taiwan wants to defend about. So I think this is a victory of Taiwan. However, there's always more to consider, of course, not necessarily just from Beijing's, just from how to be away from Beijing or how to defend Taiwan from Beijing, but also Taiwan's position in the global society. Now the president-elect understood there will be a very difficult future for Taiwan to proceed with Beijing's coercion, and then how would a party which does not have the majority in legislative yuan, which both speakers just outlined, will be able to proceed and also will be able to implement efficiently the policies that they think they could work. I think it's a big question that the president-elect and also the party DPP needs to consider. And not to mention domestically, I think probably Hans later on could elaborate even further that people probably get more of the frustration with the governing party DPP, incumbent party. That is a very normal and natural situation because in the past years, country has been through COVID, has been through a lot of the economic and international challenges. People were frustrated or are frustrated, therefore they vote probably, and younger generation vote more for the third party TPP. And how would the governing party to actually resolve or started to convince people they are working on resolving the issues they care about, the high price of the houses, the stagnant salary, and also the worry about Taiwan's economic future. I think those are the issues domestically and internationally the elected government needs to consider.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, all three, for this opening round of remarks. Let me first just flag for those in the audience, especially if you're not used to using Teams and are more familiar with Zoom, Teams also has a Q&A button. On most screens, it's at the top. If you'd like to pose a question for any or all of our panelists, please do so via that button, and we'll come to it when we come into the question and answer period. So now what I'd like to do is kind of go back around and invite each of our speakers to speak at a little more length about sort of whichever angle on this they want to take up. One interesting aspect of this on the presidential side, though, that I would just flag for everybody is first of all, how might this have played differently if Taiwan had a runoff system, the way that many, probably most presidential systems do, right? In other words, that in a three-way race, if no one gets 50%, the top two vote getters would go to a second round. And obviously this is entirely speculative, but would we have any sense about how that may have played out? And then secondly, I'm tempted to read, and I think many people are tempted to read from the results, that Lai will not be terribly strong going into the next administration, both because he doesn't have a majority in the legislature and because he didn't win a majority of the popular vote. But I'm also tempted then to think back to the 1992 US presidential election, in which Bill Clinton was elected with 43% of the vote. Very similar kind of three-way race. Ross Perot, I think, got about 19 or 20% of the vote. And then George H.W. Bush, 36 or 37, something like this. And so it was a similar breakdown in a three-way race. The U.S. also does not have a runoff system. It's actually not even a direct popular vote election with the Electoral College in between. And so Clinton was not a very weak president over two terms. So perhaps we're overplaying the degree to which the new administration in Taiwan will be hamstrung by these electoral results. But with that, let me turn back to the panelists for another round. We'll go in the same order, if that's okay. And we'll start then with John Sullivan.
Yes, so I'm gonna leave those counterfactual questions though, for a minute. I want to go through my report card for the elections, and I'll do it briefly. So there were only a couple of really unequivocal winners and losers, and then a bigger mixed bag. So I think the primary unequivocal winner was the Central Election Commission, which once again has run a fantastic, flawless election. No irregularities, no widespread reports of fraud or any of that other stuff. And again, this is a very successful election for Taiwan. And I think that, with all of the questions around the pressures that are on Taiwan's democracy and the conduct of Taiwan's democracy, I think one thing that we can, really take for granted is that Taiwan's election system is good. It works. The low-tech vote counting, the methods by which Taiwanese people, make their preferences known, I think works extremely well. I think the CEC can be very proud of that. On the losers side, I think the first person I'll choose is Ma Ying-jeou, the former president. So he was, the hand behind the throne. The KMT chose this very flawed, weak candidate, and Ma, particularly on cross-strait relations and foreign affairs, was really kind of, seen as the man behind the scenes who was directing Ho on those policy areas. Ma had a big hand in trying to facilitate the cooperation between the two main opposition parties, failed in that. And then in the last week of the campaign gave this really misguided interview with Deutsche Welle. I don't know what it is about KMT presidents and Deutsche Welle, but they always seem to get the scoop. Basically saying that there's no point in Taiwan investing in national defense because the PLA is so strong, and really Taiwan can only depend on the goodwill of Xi Jinping, and this kind of capitulationist message, which really hamstrung Hou Yu-ih in the final week of the campaign. He spent it, basically backtracking from that. And then, the final coup de grace for Ma was to be disinvited from the KMT's final election eve rally. When you consider that Ma, whether you like him or loathe him, has dedicated his whole life to the KMT, to get dissed like that, right, was absolutely completely brutal. I don't think that this campaign was good for Zhu Liluan and the KMT Central either. Again, it was clear from the outset that if they weren't able to find some way of cooperating with Ke, then it would, open open the way for this kind of result that we've seen, and they just weren't able to get it done. And the fact that the Lambai this cooperation that didn't happen in the end, absolutely dominated the campaign all the way up till November. I mean, it was absolutely crazy that they let this soap opera, just get completely out of control. They chose a weak candidate in Hou, who actually outperformed my very, very low expectations of him. But on, cross-strait relations and foreign affairs, he was an absolute neophyte. He was, just not able to fight in those areas at all. KMT Central handled the nomination really badly. They caused this rift with Guo Taiming, which again was a real blow to the consolidation of their own vote. Guo Taiming himself, I think, is another loser. Having pledged to follow whoever the KMT nominated, he then, stood as an independent candidate, ultimately didn't stand on the ballot, didn't come out in the end to support Hou very strongly. And eventually, he was saying all the way along that his one goal was to unite the opposition and to prevent the DPP from winning again. And ultimately, he completely failed in that. So I think that he is one of the unequivocal losers as well. So winners who also have something to worry about. I think Taiwan came out of this, obviously she is the first two-term sitting incumbent whose party has gone on to win a third term, and I think that speaks well to her. She's the first two-term president whose administration is not completely exhausted or corrupt, which speaks well to her. On the other hand, the issues that she came into power pledging to fix, which is the issues that Chun-Yi just spoke about, the economy, particularly for young people, and housing and these cost of living issues, hasn't been able to fix that. That was the big issue, outside of the China issue in the campaign, and it was one of the stimuli for Kerr's big vote tally. So I think she can take a win and a loss there. Lai Ching-te obviously has won. He's going to be ROC president, but he got 3 million less votes than Tsai did 4 years ago. So that's a pretty big hit. At 40.05%, he is the weakest ROC president since Chen Shui-bian in 2000. He's going to be very constrained, in his relations with the LY, the Legislative Yuan. If you saw his victory speech on Saturday night, it was a very somber victory speech, and I think that the fact that he's won with such a small margin of victory, I think is the reason. I know that the DPP themselves internally were hoping that he would just get to 40%. So, Jika, he just about made it. He got, par for the course. But, this is not a fantastic result. And speaking about Tsai again, I think if you look at the DPP's performance in the last several elections, including local elections last time and the party list, last presidential election and legislative election, you can see that actually Taiwan has been doing a lot of heavy lifting, and the DPP's performance over the last 4 years has actually been pretty limited. The pollsters did really great. Pollsters in Taiwan have had not a great reputation over the years, but they called this exactly right. They underestimated Kerr's level of support consistently, and the methodology of using landlines, we know, underestimated Kerr's support, because his support was basically young people who don't have landlines or don't answer the phone. But they got the result pretty much bang on, which is great. The Taiwanese information environment. There was a lot of panic about this big misinformation effort coming from the PRC. It seems like That didn't have a huge effect. Obviously, we have to wait till the post-election data comes out so we can see, how voters process that. But it seems like, the panic that was around, TikTok campaigns and all these other things I've been reading about didn't have a huge effect. That said, the Taiwanese information environment again wasn't great. We didn't get a huge amount of coverage of the issues. We got a lot of soap opera. We got a lot of the machinations around the Lampai that didn't happen. We got a lot of partisan stuff as always, and the quality of information available to Taiwanese voters not great, right? But this is a long-standing problem. Luo Jingren, the director who is responsible for the Hit the Road ad, this was the one positive viral moment of the entire campaign, the DPP web ad of Taiwan, literally passing the reins over to Lai Ching-te. I think that was probably the most effective campaign ad since Taiwan, the Son of Taiwan ad for Chen Shui-bian in 2000. This was, absolutely what Lai Ching-te needed to try and get a little bit of the infan, the Taiwan voters from last time around. I think that was a fantastic campaign communication. On the losers, who also have some solace. Ko Wen-je obviously didn't win the presidency, but I don't think the expectation realistically was that he was going to win this time round. What he really wanted was enough seats for his party in the legislature that he would have a very influential role, and he's absolutely going to do that. They were hoping for 7 seats. They got 8 seats. Ke is not sitting in the LY himself, but he is the TPP, and so he is going to be front and center in this coming drama over the next 4 years. It will keep him, absolutely at the top of the political agenda, and he's going to be pretty well placed to take advantage of the rocky 4 years that Lai Ching-te is going to have, going forward. So, he's well positioned to make a run in 2028 now. That said, we've seen this with third parties before, right? New Party, the TSU, the MPP is now gone, the PFP is gone. We've seen third parties that have, performed well in a single election, particularly those that are a vehicle for a single personality, and they haven't been able to institutionalize, and they haven't, been able to capitalize on that success over a longer period of time. So, we don't know exactly how the TPP is going to fare, but they are going to be, a kingmaker in the legislative yuan, and Ke is going to be, on the agenda for the next 4 years. Taiwanese youth. There was obviously a big appetite among young people. As Hans says, the composition of Ke's support seems to be, higher educated young people, professional people who are desperately looking for a third way outside of the ideological politicking between the DPP and the KMT that has structured Taiwanese politics forever. They want somebody to solve the problems that were the main issue in 2016, which still haven't been solved, right? Cost of living issues, housing ladder, graduate salaries, graduate employment. These are very, very salient issues for Taiwanese young people. And again, they've indicated that they don't trust the DPP or the KMT to get that done for them. I think, they can take solace from the fact that Lai is going to have to listen to the TPP, to a greater or lesser extent, and hopefully, those issues, are going to be on the agenda. Hou Yu-ih, obviously he lost. He underperformed the KMT party list vote quite substantially, but I think given his limitations as a candidate, he did pretty well, actually. My expectations for him were exceptionally low, and I think he outperformed those. And I think, he was gracious in his resignation speech, and I think actually, he can hold his head up, having done as good a job as he could have possibly done. I will stop there. I will talk about the implications, the ramifications in the next round. Thank you.
Great, thank you very, very much. Now let's turn to Hans Tong to talk about sort of whatever aspects of this he likes. But let me also just flag that we see it looks like a phenomenon happening in this Taiwanese election, which we talk a lot about in the United States, but less so in many other contexts, although it's happened in Taiwan before, of split ticket voting. Right, where people are voting for one party or one candidate in the presidential side, and then choosing a different party or candidate on the legislative side at the same time. So I'm interested as to how that happened this time and why. But really, whatever it is that you'd like to highlight, please go ahead.
Well, I can give that counterfactual question a try. So basically, of course, the straightforward answer is that yes, that's going to change the results. You know, if the institutions, they do exert some pressure on the candidates, especially on the blue and white camp, and they tried, but they failed. But now, if you have a second round, of course, then the institution will force them to cooperate, especially voters, not the politicians, but it is the voters will have to choose. And given this current, the current results, of course, some people are going to vote for Hou, in the second round, and that might actually give them a boost, and then Lai might in that situation Lai might lose. But a counter argument to that inference is that I believe, I agree with Jonathan and Chun-Yi in the sense that there are lots of domestic issues that I think the current administration was unable to solve, and also I think the people, especially young people, they blame DPP, but also they blame KMT, and they don't. Blaming DPP doesn't mean they trust KMT. So I suppose a lot of supporters, especially young supporters for Ko-Wen-je, might not actually switch votes. They might choose instead not to vote, and therefore, of course, it's hard to figure out. Which way might essentially eventually prevails, but so the intuition is, if we have such institutional design, that could of course help both parties to cooperate and integrate. But then I think the most essential question here is that you do have these voters who have grievances, and they don't trust either party to solve those issues, and therefore they want a third candidate. So I would imagine in the next election that issue might persist. So in other words, if DPP and KMT are not able to come up with some solution to attract young voters, then Ko-Wen-je will still has a niche out there and then to tap into. And so obviously Taiwan is going to have this kind of three-party situation is going to be the essential feature of Taiwan's political landscape. So that's probably my response to this.
Great, thank you so much. And then let's turn now to Chun-Yi to highlight any aspects of this that you like.
Right. We often been trained not to answer speculation questions, but I try. I actually think if it's again a runaway election, as Bill just suggested, I don't really think there will be a bigger change, because for the reason that it is important to note that the people actually vote for DPP in order to distinguish the possibility to be closer to China. And in any ways, actually, KMT and TPP, they do not really have a very clear distinction of their policies towards China, whereas DPP is very clear. Fair enough, and I myself said that people are frustrated with the current government, DPP. There are a lot of issues, but my sense is those issues, economic-wise and living cost-wise, and also the difficult to have a job, all that issues actually, comparatively with the China factor, they are still smaller in the Taiwanese voters' mind. And that's the reason why I still think that if KMT and TPP will not be able to really distinguish or have a clear cut of the China policy, it's very difficult to outwin the DPP in the current status. That's what I would say. And I also think that the Taiwan's election is a little bit different then election in America, Bill, please correct me if I'm wrong, but election in Taiwan is a direct vote, which are people vote directly to the presidential candidate. My very limited understanding of American presidential election is not direct vote. So it might place a little bit of a difference as referred to your example of Clinton's example. But having said so, still, I think what I would say is I'm actually, as a scholar observing, I'm very happy to see there's a third way emerged, that is a TPP. But the question is, which is distinguish the third voice away from the DPP KMT's opponents in that constant China factor, all that. However, the big question is, will it be sustainable? As both speakers earlier also mentioned, previously the People's First Party seems to be promising, spin off from the KMT, and there are also some promising smaller party after sunflower movements enter legislative yuan. Where are they now? So whether TPP will be able to go beyond the one-man show, let's say, only focus on Ke Wen-je, and actually establish a third party for Taiwan. This is something that I would like to observe.
Great, thank you very much. I will do maybe one more sort of round of remarks before we move into the question and answers. Let me just again remind those in the audience, please do post questions under the Q&A tab. We will come back and answer as many of them as we possibly can when we get to the question round. So in this round, maybe we could talk just a little bit about two factors, as well as anything else that each of you might want to talk about. One is this sort of differentiation of domestic and foreign policy, right? Because I think while it's true that the DPP has a fairly clear line on what they see as the best way to manage the cross-strait relationship, they have not always had as clear a line on other aspects of foreign policy. The KMT, I think, can be rightly criticized for having internal splits about both cross-straits policy and foreign policy, right? That there are many different strands, some of which are much more subtle and much more interesting than others, and some of which are much more coherent than others, but they don't actually have a very good record of kind of formulating a one policy for the whole party. And then on domestic issues, I would say actually something quite similar, right? That the DPP has been criticized with some justification for not delivering on all of the domestic priorities, but at least they have some coherence of what those priorities are, whereas I don't see that as clearly from the KMT side, but I could be wrong. And if any of you see more coherence on that side, that'd be interesting. The second thing is this idea of the protest voter young people's party, or young people attractor party, which it looks like the Taiwan People's Party and Ke Wen-je kind of played this time. Is this of a piece, do you think, with what we're seeing in some other countries? So, I mean, in Italy, for example, Giuseppe Conte and the Five-Star Movement, so-called, or in a number of other places, people just sort of, young people turning away from more traditional political parties and politicians and voting for these sort of protest groups. And if that is the case, is it sustainable as a viable third party? And if that's not the case, what do you think actually attracted so many young people to move over and vote for Ke? And actually also a number of legislative candidates. I mean, the party did remarkably well for an upstart third party in the legislative election, which I would argue is actually harder to make a real impact on than in the presidential race. I mean, Song Chu-Yu never seemed to get a lot of his supporters into the Li Fa-yuan in the various times that he tried to put forward a third-party candidacy, for example. So with that, let's go ahead in the same order again for another round.
Yeah, let me deal with the second question. It's a really fascinating question. I mean, I think that when Ke first competed for Taipei mayor, at that point, he really was a political outsider, and he really was an insurgent candidacy, and he was proposing something radical. You know, he had this radical transparency in his campaign. You know, he was, you know, this completely unfiltered way of communicating was something that was completely new in Taiwanese politics. He attracted, you know, young voters. He had this incredible social media campaign, and it was something really new. And it was this outsider that fit the bill of, you know, Beppe Grillo and all of these other campaigns that you're mentioning, Bill. I think since that time, you know, he's a pretty experienced political operative now. He was Taipei mayor for 8 years. You know, he's been on the scene now for a long time. I think the thing that really has killed the TPP is the lack of institutionalization beyond Ke. You can see from the campaign that we just had, the TPP had no money for doing all of these, you know, 早选晚会, you know, 扫街, all these kind of campaign activities that you really need to do to mobilize people. I mean, basically, you know, he had Kepi TV, right? He had this online communication outlet that was basically the, you know, the main thing driving their campaign. He wasn't able to send surrogates out everywhere. They didn't have, you know, a lot of legislators to help mobilize people, and whether they're able to, you know, to institutionalize so that they're able to better mobilize, you know, the obvious support that they do have. That for me is a really big question, because other parties, other third parties in Taiwan, you know, they've also come up and they've also had stunning electoral results in one election and been unable to sustain that or to take advantage of that. I mean, we've just seen now, you know, the MPP is gone from the legislature. You know, the latest, you know, in the last round, you know, the latest third force to come up, that's now gone. And it's easy enough for me to imagine that, you know, the TPP could be wiped out in 4 years' time, unless, you know, they do something to really consolidate and move beyond the presence of Ke, right? Because having somebody, you know, having a dominant founder leader, you know, connected to one personality, you know, that's a double-edged sword, because you can lose that popularity, you know, pretty quickly. You can lose that resonance pretty quickly. And, you know, particularly with somebody like Ke, who is, you know, he's divisive, he's unfiltered, he's flawed, he's, you know, he's volatile, he's unpredictable. It's pretty easy for me to imagine that, you know, the TPP in 4 years could be gone, right? You know, equally, you know, depending on how savvily they utilize their pivotal position in the legislature, you know, they could also be a major force, and Ko Wen-je could be a very strong presidential candidate in 2028. So I think, you know, we have to wait and see to see how they play their hand.
Great, thank you very much. Now let's turn to Hans Tong.
So you asked a couple of questions. So first, I guess, of course, I would agree with you in the sense that, well, KMT's lack of coherence. And I think, of course, it's easily explained, given KMT is now in the opposition. And I think that KMT's party machine has been undermined substantially during these years. And therefore, it has to carry a lot of interests locally. And therefore, it's hard for them to come up with a very coherent package to sell. Nonetheless, I also want to emphasize that, I mean, I have told a lot of friends of mine about this view of mine. So basically, I think there's a clear divide between, for example, KMT and TPP on the one side and TPP on the other side, which is, I think TPP is more like a realist. So they believe that, you know, to defend Taiwan, you need to form alliances with Japan, United States, and other Western democracies to buy more weapons to defend yourself, to arm yourself. They don't quite believe in, for example, commerce, trade. But on the other hand, when you see KMT, I mean, they have a pretty coherent ideology, maybe not necessarily between foreign and domestic policies, but in terms of their strategy towards China, I mean, they will always emphasize the importance of dialogues commercial exchanges. So that's more like a liberal. So they are like, you know, they are liberalism believers. They believe that, you know, if you can have all these cross trades and investments, then you can create peace. And of course, that's why Hou actually and the whole team behind KMT devised this campaign strategy of saying we have three Ds, right? Defense, de-escalate, and what's the third? Dialogue. So in other words, I think that's a clear divide between TPP and KMT. And of course, in that sense, maybe we can interpret the result this way, that obviously realist argument, you know, won the battle this time, even though it's not a landslide victory. So, you know, Lighting just got 40% of the votes, and also lost the majority in the Congress. And therefore, I mean, you could say, I mean, by and large, a lot of people, you know, in Taiwan still believe in the realist argument. But on the other hand, you do have quite a substantial number of people out there who believe in liberal values, in the sense that, you know, we should have dialogue with Beijing, even though, of course, Beijing, there are lots of strings attached, right, to the dialogue, and Beijing asks for a lot more than just dialogue itself. So, so it's like, you know, my response to that. And also, of course, I think this point has been emphasized by Jonathan and Chun-Yi for a couple of times. There are lots of domestic issues, and, you know, when it comes to the question you asked about this protester mindset, and especially among younger generations, I think it seems that among them among people in the Taiwanese society, there has been some kind of fatigue in terms of this rhetoric of, you know, defending against China. And then, so I mean, so I guess, well, for this election, I think it's not until very recently that the focus was shifted to this China factor. Before that, I mean, it was about scandals of different versions, and different people have different versions of their own scandals, and therefore it's all about these domestic, not necessarily, not even domestic issues, but about candidates' personal, you know, issues like your real estate investments. So I mean, but it's not really not until recently, the you know, final few weeks, for example, the rocket like messaging, the rocket launching messages, even though they got the English version very, very wrong. And also Jonathan mentioned Ma Ying-jeou's interview with Deutsche Welle. So that's another instance where, you know, people were reminded that, well, this is actually a big issue, and that might have contributed to the victory of lie to some extent. So coming back to that prosperity mindset, I think that that's just going back to my initial point. So if DPP and KMT are not able to come up with some solutions to make themselves more attractive to young people, I suppose, I mean, these people will still search for, I mean, Cohen's, I think, it's a little bit, I mean, he's a little bit Trumpish in a sense that he used a lot of populist rhetoric, and he used to say, like, return the country to you guys. So in other words, it's like, he's a little bit anti-establishment, even though he himself realizes some kind of establishment, you know, mentality, like he bragging about how smart he is and, you know, his degrees. So I mean, he's something of a paradox, I have to say. But at least for a lot of young people, his attraction comes from this very Trumpish appearance, you know, appeal to young people directly, and always it's almost like he didn't use this word, but it's like drain the swamp. It's like, you know, there are lots of corruption inside the government, and I'm coming to, you know, to solve this issue. So I mean, there are lots of like Trump like characters in this guy. And so as I said, I mean, I guess if KMT and DPP are not able to redesign themselves and to make them more attractive to young people and make people trust them that they're able to solve those issues, I think Ke or his party will still have a substantial market share in Taiwan.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And then last to Chun-Yi.
Thank you. I really appreciate Hans' IR perspective of realism and liberalism, because this is also what I spoke with my students, whether China can buy Taiwanese people's hearts and minds. I think that I agree that Hans' perspective, that's true, that Kuomintang KMT seems to believe in more of the trade will be able to resolve the differences. But also I wanted to make a point that actually it's been seen, Taiwanese people have seen that China, although it's trying, or KMT was trying to be more economically closely and hopefully to erase the difference between China and Taiwan, it didn't work. And a very vivid example, if we don't talk about Xinjiang, we don't talk about what China did elsewhere, a very vivid example was Hong Kong, like 2019, and that result, Tsai Ing-wen landscape victory in the last election, 58%. She had the voters saying there. And I think that is a very important point to note that actually it's what we can see, what China is doing to Hong Kong, and that's really our close neighbor. And Taiwanese people do not want to end up Hong Kong, like Hong Kong, let's say. And that's sort of very strong, powerful vote tracking for the DPP in that sense. Having said so, of course, that to answer what Bill's question, I also think that both DPP and the KMT, they do not have very coherent either domestic or foreign policy. And to be very, in that sense, I also think that Taiwan's foreign policy has not really gone beyond China and USA. And this is what Taiwan really need to look into and to anchor. Under Tsai Ing-wen's presidency, that was a New Southbound policy, which was initiative. That was a good and also a sort of encouraging developments. But I would like to, and I hope that the president-elect, the governing party will look into Taiwan's otherwise foreign policy and be more coherent in that sense, because it's important, especially Taiwan being cornered by China to because of a lot of the diplomatic allies. Taiwan needs to be more creative to think of second or track 2 diplomacy or track 3 diplomacy. With semiconductors investment, for instance, is my area I'm working on, that is possible to foster a more of connection of Taiwan with other countries. And then to answer, Bill, your second question of the protesting group votes, I have to confess that I am limited on other country, but I just compare, for instance, Ko Wen-je with not far away, not long ago, Han Kuo-yu, who actually was also quite straightforward, and we say that Han was a populism figure. And why we didn't say Ke is a populism figure? Because actually Ke may really have some policy to offer, whereas Han was really just populism and attracting. Of course, Han also attracting different age groups. Han attract more of the elderly group, and Ke attracted more of the younger group, as Han just indicated. But it's just also to say that this kind of straightforward way of election, it's not just of Taiwan, other country, but also if you take a more broader comparison, is TPP with the previous KMT candidate Han Kuo-yu. Although Han this time seems to be lost quieter than before because there's a lot of backfire of Han wave. So I will stop here.
Great, thank you very much. I'll just say one quick thing and then we'll turn to questions, which is that on foreign policy, I actually think it's interesting that the last 8 years have seen some more initiatives, I think, than had been there really before, beyond the U.S. and mainland China. I mean, notably the southbound policy or the outreach to Southeast Asia, I think has been rather meaningful, at least in Indonesia, which is the one country in Southeast Asia that I feel I know more about, to comment that it has actually resonated with a number of constituencies there, notably academics, in fact, as well as Indonesian laborers who've been working and going back and forth to Taiwan for a long time. But many of those laborers are changing their view about Taiwan and their place within Taiwanese society even. And then, of course, Japan, too. I think Japan is changing, perhaps, or at least is solidifying some of its policy with regard to security in East Asia broadly and vis-a-vis Taiwan specifically. And I think that there's got to be some outreach there as well that's happening. But I could be wrong, or different interpretations obviously are very welcome. But let me pose now the questions also from the audience. There's a few that have come in, and again, audience members, please do continue posting your questions on that Q&A tab. They're kind of far-reaching and in different directions. So what I'll do is I'll just pose the question to all three of you. And then if you actually want to go in the reverse order from how we've been going so far, just to answer them relatively quickly for each one if you can. But you can elaborate as well. The first question is about the new vice president, Xiaobi Kim. And the question says, she seems to be a rather distinct political figure coming from a different background than most other vice presidents, either the candidates in this election or historically. And the questioner alludes to her long experience in the United States as well as her education there. And therefore, do you think that she will have a particular influence or role in shaping the policies of the Lai administration or even reorienting other parts of Taiwanese politics? So let's start with Chun-Yi and then go to Hans and John.
Sure. I'm answering the question about Xiao Meiqing, which is the vice president-elect. I think she actually is a very excellent candidate to be into assisting the presidency. Xiao has been known as a very experienced politician and also diplomat. She was actually assigned to the U.S. as Taiwan's representative to the U.S. Before the election to be called back to run for the election. So I actually think Xiao Meiqing is a very good candidate of negotiating, representing, and discussing of Taiwan's international position. I hope not just with the U.S., but globally. So I think it's a benefit, it's an add-on benefit for Lai Ching-te's government.
Great, thanks. Hans, do you want to take a stab at this?
Yeah. I would agree with Chun-Yi that well, she's very special and very capable as a VP for Lai Ching-te. And of course, I think, as we all know, I mean, Lai Ching-te has a reputation of being a very strong supporter for independence, and he himself has made several open remarks on that. And therefore, I think that does create some worries in the U.S. and for U.S. policymakers. And therefore, I think Xiao Meiqing has given her very excellent resume and also is extremely capable English proficiency and being able to communicate with U.S. officials more directly. And this is actually, in a sense, a weakness of Lai Ching-te. And therefore, she makes a very good compliment to Lai Ching-te. And therefore, she would be extremely functional in terms of guiding the foreign policy in the next Lai administration. But if the question is more about her political prospect, that I don't know, because I guess this is something we might have to discuss like in 8 years, but not now. But I think she obviously, I would agree totally with Chun-Yi. She's actually very good.
Yeah, she was I think of the 3 VP picks, she was the most successful by far. I think the Wu Xing and Zhao Xiaokang were pretty much Hail Mary picks, and they didn't pan out. Whereas, she is, she's close to Taiwan. She's got lots of connections in the US. The US likes her. They trust her. She's bilingual. She's very articulate. She's very sharp. She's very smart on global affairs. And she complements, Lai Ching-te in that way. And I think she's also, a reassuring presence for the Americans, given that Lai has this, he had this potential vulnerability in his candidacy, having said that he's a worker for Taiwan independence. We know that big story, right? And Xiao Mei-jin was, she was trusted, in the US. So I think that, she was a fantastic pick. She likes cats. She's a close confidant of Taiwan. So I think, there's some continuity there as well, right? And I think that, her ability to appeal to women voters, to appeal to younger voters, I think that was a real boost for Lai's candidacy as well. I think that the PRC is very unhappy with her presence in the coming administration. I spoke to a bunch of people in the PRC, and she's been sanctioned twice. She's seen as a kind of, an American operative in Taiwan, by the PRC. And I think that that's going to make, the prospects of a thaw coming from the PRC side for the new Lai administration was very limited anyway, but I think her presence makes it even more unlikely. But I think, I endorse, the fact that she was a great pick, and for the purposes of the election, the purposes of reassuring the Americans, I think her pick was absolutely bang on.
Great. Thank you all three very much. The next question actually relates to what we were talking about towards the tail end of our earlier remarks, which is how can Lai Ching-te's foreign policy approach be similar or different from Tsai Ing-wen's, his predecessors? Can Lai's individual idiosyncrasies or particular approaches change the general approach of foreign policy from Taiwan as compared to Tsai's approach? We can go again in the same order that we just did. So Chun-Yi, you're up first, and then Hans, and then John.
Right. So I do not think Tsai's foreign policy would be dramatically different from President Tsai's foreign policy, especially in terms of the U.S.-China relations. It's supposed to be a continuity and also add on with what both speakers Chong and Hans says, that his vice president Xiao Mei-jin, Peking Xiao, has been working closely with Tsai and has been also a great negotiator, look, cat warrior, to represent Taiwan globally. I don't see there would be a major difference between Lai's presidency's foreign policy in comparison to Tsai's foreign policy in that sense.
Great, thanks.
Right.
Hans?
Yeah, right. I don't think it would be a lot of differences, and I guess even people value continuity from Tsai administration to Lai administration, and I think, well, I'm not sure if this is good to say so, but I think Lai Ching-te now is going to put under a pretty tight leash, in the sense that people know his past. And then, Americans are worried, Chinese are worried, and therefore, and some people here are worried. Therefore, for Lai Ching-te, I guess for his first, I don't know, for his first term or for his first couple of years, he will have to kind of gradually learn how to get the trust from all these key players, and then formulate something of his own. But at least the presence of Xiao Mei-jin would be a great reassurance for a lot of policymakers around the world, and that Tsai's very stable and moderate policy is going to continue, and it's not going to be a troublemaker. And so I guess that's something people want. I'll stop here.
Great,
yeah,
thanks.
Just a couple things to add there. Obviously, Western countries have got used to Taiwan, right? They trust her. I think, we've got used to her caution, She's very temperate. She's very careful in her language. Lai Ching-te is much less disciplined when it comes to rhetoric, right? And we've seen this through the campaign where he's made a couple of slips in the language that he's using. And I think that it's going to take a little bit of time for Western leaders to develop the same level of trust that they have with Taiwan, right? But that's a normal part and parcel of a change in leadership. And as Han said, he's going to be on a tight leash. He's not going to have the opportunity to propose anything that's really radically different to the Thai road. But already during the campaign, he tied himself very closely to the Taiwan way anyway. So I don't think that there's going to be a major change there. One thing that I do hope, and this was mentioned by Chun-Yi and you, Bill, that I think the new southbound policy is the real low-key success of the Taiwan era. It kind of flies under the radar, but not only does it help Taiwan to diversify the economy away from reliance on mainland China, but it also helps to diversify away from, either leaning towards the US or leaning towards China. It allows them to have a different set of foreign relations in addition to the US and China, which, ultimately Taiwan needs to avoid being a pawn in the US-China relationship. And I think that the new southbound policy has really enabled Taiwan to, have this dream of being this, this global Taiwan, this Haiyan Dao, this ocean island. And I think that those connections with South Asia and Southeast Asia are really important. I really hope that Lai Ching-te will make this a priority to continue that.
Great. One thing that occurs to me as well, with regard to the new administration and the whole issue around sort of Taiwan sovereignty policy, or what the approach on sovereignty or independence, unification, what the approach might be. I happened to be in Taiwan, I guess it was in March of 2023, and it was right at the time that Lai Ching-te was being sort of designated as the person who was going to carry the torch for the DPP. And right at that moment, the party headquarters were extraordinarily keen to publicize a very carefully crafted statement that they'd come up with that laid out exactly what their position was. And I think, unless I'm wrong, because I haven't followed every twist and turn of the campaign as closely as all three of you have, but I think Lai pretty much stuck to that script throughout. And the script, from what I remember, I was handed the script actually by the DPP officials at the time that I saw, and it said very clearly, we want to maintain the status quo, and we think the status quo is something like de facto sovereignty. Right? They don't say independence, they don't say, all the buzzwords, but they do assert fairly clearly that in sticking to status quo, what we're doing is actually preserving a de facto sovereignty, which I think is an interesting approach to that question, and I think also speaks to the fact that even the party leaders recognize that this is a potential liability. And in that sense, it also reminds me of back in 2000, when Chen Shui-bian and even more so Li Xiulian had been on record for years as being sort of very vocal supporters of de jure independence, and then tried to backtrack during the campaign, and apparently did so at least successfully enough to convince voters and not to cause a crisis when they were in office. Let me pose the remaining questions to you. This one is very quick and almost a sort of yes or no answer, which is, don't you think that the internationalization of Taiwan's cause, quote unquote, i.e. what Taiwan has been doing for the past several years, don't you think that's more important actually than just counting up the number of diplomatic allies? So I guess meaning even if all countries were to switch recognition to the mainland, would that actually be less important than if Taiwan manages to convince global players or the world at large to take seriously its position?
Bill, would you like me to go ahead? Yeah, sure. I think this question, of course, we would say yes, we should see what Taiwan has been doing in the past years. And actually, not just past 8 years, past many years, Taiwan has been struggling, and Taiwan has been transformed itself from authoritarian regime to a democratized country, I would say. Of course, this is more important than counting the diplomatic allies. But this is also, we have to look into the realistic situation that what China has been coerced of all the other countries to being trace them away from Taiwan. And in fact, that's, well, if I can elaborate a little bit more, if we can say track 2 diplomacy is more important than track 1 diplomacy, this answers question is absolutely yes. I will stop here.
Great,
Well,
thank you. Go ahead.
Right. So, and of course, I think there's some discussion on that here, and especially Jane just mentioned at the beginning of this event that China just going to snatch Nauru away from Taiwan, and therefore, but that people might have gotten used to that, and might actually even they don't quite care about that at all. So, well, indeed, I mean, some people make this argument that we should maybe spend more resources and make more efforts to something that is more substantial instead of just the nominal number of diplomatic allies. What I see a value in that argument, but I guess from the perspective of the administration, they will still try very hard to keep the current number, even though losing one doesn't necessarily, deal a huge blow to Taiwan in any ways. But still, because in international politics, I mean, international organizations, these establishments are still important, and therefore, I mean, I guess there's no way for Taiwan to give up all these existing allies or opportunities to join the international forum. But I guess what I would say is just that if we were to lose any more, it's probably not going to be a major issue here anyway.
Yeah, I would just add that it's important for the PRC whether Taiwan has any formal diplomatic allies or not. I mean, by the standards of the Montevideo Convention, Taiwan meets all of the prerequisites for statehood, right? Its own territory, its own laws, its own political system, etc., etc., etc. But by other standards, which is external recognition by other states, Taiwan doesn't meet that standard. And I think that for the PRC, it's important that any source of solace or any suggestion that Taiwan as a state is removed. So I think for the PRC, it really is important. And given the situation, I think it's important for Taiwan to maintain those diplomatic allies as well.
Great, thank you. We've got now a really broad question that kind of asks you to think about what's been going on the last couple of days, but also what's likely to come from China in terms of China's response to this. And the questioner says, what is China's likeliest immediate response? But I would actually invite you to say not just immediate, but maybe slightly longer term response to the electoral result from a geopolitical and geoeconomic perspective. Some of this we've already talked about, but maybe just to really nail it. And how would the US and its allies, as well as other regional powers like India and Japan, and I would assume also places like Australia, or Southeast Asian players, respond to a Chinese sea blockade of Taiwan? That's getting really speculative, but it would be interesting to hear all of your thoughts on that. So go ahead.
Right. This is a very interesting and broad question, as Bill just indicated. But I would also, since it's a broad question, so I have a more of an out-of-box answer in that sense. We probably should not just think about China's reaction on Taiwan's presidential election, because China is not just about Taiwan and China. It's a geopolitical jigsaw game. So if we just straightforwardly to say whether China's reaction, I would say, yeah, China would like actually to directly take over Taiwan because they don't believe in Taiwanese voters, because they think that Taiwanese voters will continuously vote for DPP, there's no way that Taiwan would like to reunite with the motherland. But the reality is not that simple. Chinese calculation is not just about what Taiwanese people vote. It's also about the geopolitical situation and also the dependence on Taiwan, the global dependence on Taiwan. We actually also need to factor in what are going on globally. Ukraine-Russia war still continuing, and the Gaza conflict war also is getting bigger. I think that it really needs to consider in a sense of the global dynamics and to think about what China would do. I wouldn't think that China would directly C-block Taiwan. China does not approve what Taiwan president-elect, that is for sure. However, to what extent China will actually act on, that is a big question for us to all observe. I would say China could act on a more immediately action that we just discussed to cut off Taiwan's another diplomatic allies, for instance. China may also have more of economic coercion on Taiwan. I also mentioned previously about the possibility to suspend the ECFA, which is to let Taiwan or Taiwanese people feel the punishment from China. But to what extent that would escalate to the actual sea blockade, I have a very big question mark there.
All right. So maybe let me do a service to all by just summarizing what we have witnessed. So there's a first very soft statement issued by the Taiwan office, right, emphasizing the DPP has lost the majority, and also they're going to continue with work with other political forces in Taiwan to promote unification. And also China's Eastern Theater Command also just aired clips of military exercises instead of staging the real one. So that's, if you view that as a response. And then of course there was this narrow case. And then also we haven't seen any responses in terms of the economic sanctions, like or canceling ECFA, for example. So that's why, well, I would have to say, of course, at this moment, it seems that China's responses were relatively softer than expected, given Lai's win. But of course, I mean, the thing is China probably won't stop here, of course. I mean, but it's just there are lots of variables out there. You know, for example, in the coming days, whether Lai Ching is going to make other remarks and how he handles the transition, how he handles the inaugural speech. So I think there are all these variables. And of course, you know, as I just mentioned, Lai Ching now is on a title-ish. And so for China, it's for them to observe whether Lai Ching would give them what they want. But I guess that's not likely. So I guess in the end, China will still do something more substantial. But you know, we have witnessed, of course, like, you know, fighter jets flying across the middle line and aircraft carriers. I mean, I wonder. So this is actually, I had a discussion with another colleague of mine actually a few days ago. So like economically, we can see, of course, canceling ECFA is one thing that's a major step, right? But how far can it go militarily? So my speculation is, again, a wild speculation, is that they might not do it now, as long as Lai Ching can constrain himself in terms of saying anything he wanted, I suppose. And then, and you know, also given you know what we have witnessed in these days, like it seems that U.S. obviously also play a major role in terms of handling the situation. But Biden's response to the election is only like, we don't support independence, and then also they send a delegation to Taiwan. So in other words, it seems that U.S. is now, of course, is trying to handle the situation well. So I guess given all these developments, I suppose in this wild speculation, China's not going to do something major, unless the surprises everyone. Otherwise, I would suppose this is something we're going to see in the near future. I'll stop here.
So I think that the PRC is another one of these losers who can also take some solace from the election result. So notwithstanding the pressures that they've been exerting on Taiwan over the last 8 years, they couldn't prevent a third consecutive DPP president winning. However, they can also point to the face-saving fact that 60% of people voted against the DPP in the presidential election, right? And they're also a minority. They haven't got a majority in the LY. I think that had Lai won a landslide a la Thai, or had they, also got the majority in Parliament, I think we would have seen a very different reaction. The fact is, we've seen a limited, muted reaction. I think speaks to the fact that there is some face saving there. They know that Lai is going to be constrained. And actually, it's not a bad result for the PRC. If you consider, that they wanted to buy some time to continue this, rebalancing of the power in the Taiwan Strait. They know that Lai Ching-te is going to be constrained for the next 4 years. It buys them time, the PLA time, for another 4 years of modernization, another 4 years to tilt the balance of power in the Taiwan Strait, so that we get through to 2027 is the big date, but then going beyond that, the PLA has time to build their forces up a bit more. I think in the real short term, they're going to keep the pressure up, to the extent that we've seen over the last 8 years at least, to make sure that Lai's inaugural speech is moderate. I think that's the next big kind of key point for the PRC. I think that a major naval blockade of Taiwan would be tantamount to a declaration of war, and I don't think that they're going to go that far. The escalation ladder, as Chun-Yi says, has many steps until you get to naval blockade or anything akin to that. But I think that exactly the same playbook that they've been doing for the last 8 years, I think is what we're going to see. They've got many levers, many tools, many things that they can use to put pressure on Lai, and I should expect that we're going to continue seeing those.
Can I add one more point?
Of course.
So just to piggyback on Jonathan's point, I mean, and the fact that Taiwan is going to have a divided government actually gives China, PRC a leverage in manipulating Taiwan's domestic politics. So I guess if they are smart, they're going to play that, that card much more than, playing the military card. Thank you.
No, I think all of that's very valid point, and I would agree actually with what all three of you have been saying. The one little wrinkle that I might add would be to say that I think on the mainland side, there's a fair bit of frustration and confusion about Taiwan and how to deal with this Taiwan problem or Taiwan question. That, if we go all the way back, say 30 years ago, China was very, very much pleased with the so-called 1992 consensus, to the point where they still bring it up every single time. I don't think that's going anywhere. I mean, I think that's really been sort of outdated for a long time. And I think that the leadership in China started to feel that during sort of the second Jiang Zemin administration, especially, but even before that, really from the time of the 95-96 crisis. And they started to try to adopt a much more kind of harsh policy or forceful policy towards Taiwan. And that backfired pretty badly over that time period. And then Hu Jintao came in 2002 when the DPP was actually already in power in Taiwan, and basically had this very soft policy that seemed to work from the mainland's perspective, that this kind of softer, more conciliatory policy. Let's build more links, let's cultivate trade, let's open up more exchanges and so on, and be patient about pushing a unification agenda. That seemed to work very, very well throughout both the Chen Shui-bian administrations and Ma Ying-jeou years. And then more recently, I think that Xi Jinping has become frustrated, that he doesn't see sort of things moving in the right direction. And if anything, things are moving in the quote unquote wrong direction from his point of view. But I don't think he has an answer. I don't think China wants to just return to the very hardline policy of the 1990s, but at the same time, they're not satisfied with the softer conciliatory approach. And so I think right now it's a real problem in that if they go for something very hard-edged, like cutting off trade or really disrupting Taiwan's trade with even not a formal blockade, but very intense, say, military exercises on multiple sides of Taiwan. That's actually counterproductive. That from China's point of view, that's cutting back all of the links that they want to foster as part of their overall policy agenda. And that's pushing Taiwan to be more distant from the mainland, not closer. But at the same time, if they don't do anything, then they do risk Taiwan politics kind of moving further and further away from them on its own. And so I agree. I think they'll try to put pressure as much as possible in terms of getting more moderation from Taiwan's government. But beyond that, I mean, maybe more of these gray zone operations of all different kinds, cyber attacks, perhaps, but also these sort of incursions over the middle line, and both on the air, in the air, and on sea. But it's hard for me to see much beyond signaling. I think these are meant to send a message, right? That China's serious, that China's not happy, that they want to sort of push things in a particular direction. But I think it also sends an unintended message that they don't really know how to do this effectively. And I would also echo what Hans especially was saying, that this statement and the behavior so far from the Chinese government about the elections, to me, says that they've found something that's actually fairly subtle and fairly sophisticated as a sort of face-saving measure, to say, okay, we're not happy that this happened, but we can sort of spin it in a way that looks more positive for China. And I think that degree of subtlety and sophistication about the way Taiwan politics work is actually progress from where China was even 4 years ago or 8 years ago. Any other last remarks from any of you? Yes, Chun-Yi.
Well, just to very quickly to say that what China actually is in a very delicate dilemma, and they wanted to reassure not to Americans how strong they are. They need to send signals to reassure their own people how they could better handle Taiwan issue. And that is the core agenda of Xi, that how they could pacify their own people, that they can handle Taiwan, but looks like they cannot just yet.
Great. I'm afraid our meeting is going to cut off very soon, and we are basically out of time. But if either of you, Hans or John, want to say anything in conclusion?
Yeah, I would just say, adding to what Chun-Yi just said, one of the big hashtags on Chinese social media over the weekend was, you've been telling us for 8 years that Taiwanese people hate the DPP, and yet here they are, they've won again. It's all about controlling the message within mainland China itself. We know that they care more about regime stability than they actually do about getting Taiwan back. Getting Taiwan back today is not the major priority. Staying in power long term is the priority. So.
But that's actually a very good point on which to sort of conclude, and looking at the mainland just very briefly as well. I think it is very interesting to try to parse how much not just the state, but actually the public in the mainland really knows about Taiwan or Taiwan politics. And I'm not yet certain how much I think things have changed in the last, say, 10 years. I would say 10 years ago or more, the level of knowledge and understanding of Taiwan in the mainland was very low, and was very much subject to sort of mainland media messaging and so on about who's actually an important political figure or what public opinion in Taiwan really looks like. I think that's evolving, though. I think people are becoming better informed in the mainland about Taiwan. Hans, did you have anything to add by way of conclusion?
Yeah, sure. Maybe let me share with you guys one interesting pattern to end the event today. So it seems that there's a consistent pattern that all the presidents are NTU graduates. So don't bet against NTU graduates next time, especially for, I guess, from KMT side. So do not name someone who has something to do with NTU.
That's yes, that's a bit of sort of flag waving for the school, but yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely a very, very august institution, both within Taiwan and internationally. So with that, let me say thank you very much, all three of you, for fantastic contributions and a really good conversation. I've learned a lot. I hope that those in our audience have as well. Thank you to everyone in the audience for tuning in at all your various time zones, and also for your great questions and engagement. I'm really encouraged by how many people actually stayed through all the way to the end. Thank you very much. And with that, we conclude. And
thank you.
Farewell.
Thank you. Bye.
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 Thank you. Bye.